Welcome to the services of the Magnolia Church of Christ. Thank you for joining us. We hope you are encouraged by the message today.
Welcome, everyone. Turn to Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11. And we are finishing up our study of the characters in Hebrew 11 and the Christian attributes we can learn from them this morning. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about Abraham, we've talked about Moses, we've talked about a number of others, Rahab, that have been listed and explained here in the first part of Hebrews 11. And as I was preparing for this sermon, I read a commentator, basically it was actually a preacher that was talking about this particular thing, and this passage, and he said, it's almost like the Hebrew writer got to toward the end of the sermon, realized he ran out of time, and just threw it all at the end, kind of like a lot of preachers do from the pulpit. And so I don't believe that's what this is, but it does seem like they put a whole lot of stuff right at the end of Hebrews 11, where they went into a lot more detail in other parts. And so we're going to read that together first, and then we're going to talk about it. Beginning in verse 32, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in the deserts and mountains and in the dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Here the Hebrew writer lists a few names without comment, and then describes a bunch of others without names. And so he's talking about Christians. He's talking about, not Christians, he's talking about men and women of God who have done great deeds for God. Some he lists and some he doesn't by name. And so this morning we're going to walk through the ones he lists by name, and then we're going to talk about some of the characteristics they have in common, and then we're going to go down to those he doesn't list by name and talk about some of the trials that they went through. The first one he lists was Gideon. And before I go through all of these together, I want to point out one similarity. Every one of these six that are listed, we know had flaws. We know from the biblical account where they are described, they had problems, and yet they are considered to be leaders of faith and representatives of faith to God. The first one was Gideon. If you remember, when Gideon was called to be a judge, he didn't want to do it. His story is told in Judges 6 through 8. But basically, Gideon, God had to convince Gideon that he was God before Gideon decided that he was going to be a judge for God. And what we know is that once Gideon made that step, he followed God. He became a great leader until the end of his life. And then at the end of his life, he led them into iniquity and idol worship. But Gideon was listed as one of those people of faith. The second was Barak. Barak was a great military leader, but he was scared to lead without Deborah. Deborah was the judge that Barak had to have to lead the people of Israel. And so he didn't have enough faith to lead on his own. All of you have heard many stories about Samson. If there's a flawed character in the Old Testament, Samson had a lot of flaws. Samson had a problem with women. Samson had a problem with anger. Samson had a problem with pride. Samson had all of these problems, yet God lists Samson as one of those who would not give up on God, who had faith in God. In Judges 11, we read the story of Jephthah. Jephthah was the one that made a rash vow and said, God, if you give me this battle, in Judges 11, I will kill and offer whatever comes to greet me when we come back from that battle. And as you recall the story, Jephthah's daughter was the one that ran to and meet him. I guess he thought it was going to be his daughter. But whatever he thought, he offered his daughter to God because he made that rash vow. Then there's David. David was called a man after God's own heart. And David was a tremendous leader of the people of Israel. But David also had lots of flaws. David was an adulterer. David was a murderer. And God told David, because of all the people you've killed and all the war you've waged, you can't build my temple. That has to come from your son. So David had lots and lots of flaws. And then Samuel. We remember the story of Samuel as a child, how his mom Hannah gave Samuel to God. And we remember what a great, wise judge Samuel was. A prophet is what he actually was. And how he was such a great servant of God. But sometimes we forget the end of his life. Turn to 1 Samuel 8, verses 1 through 3. 1 Samuel 8, 1 through 3. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. You could make the argument that because Samuel's sons were so evil, that's why they went from judges to king. Because the people did not want to be ruled by Joel and Abijah. They were so evil. And that's why they wanted a king. There were other reasons why they wanted a king. But had Samuel had faithful sons, we don't know what would have happened. But we do know that his sons were not faithful. And so Samuel, despite all the good he did for God, did not leave a legacy of his children following God. And so each one of these prophets had many, many flaws. But that should give us strength, should give us hope to know that we as followers of God are going to have our own flaws. And that we can still be followers of God with these flaws. Then in verse 33, we read about the anonymous people. Well, after Samuel, it's the prophets, and so it doesn't list which prophets it is, but he talks about the prophets. And then in verse 33, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight, women received back their dead. We don't know who they're talking about in every one of these situations, who the writer's talking about. We just know that the Hebrew writer says people of God did this. People of God experienced this. Righteous people had all of these things happen to them. And the key point there is verse 34. All of these people were made strong out of weakness. All of these people were weak, and God made them strong because they were righteous for Him. And God's righteousness came down to them. If we are going to be righteous people, we also have to come out of our weakness. Turn to John 15, verse 5. John 15, verse 5. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Turn to 2 Corinthians 3, verse 5. 2 Corinthians 3, verse 5. Not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything is coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And then on the same page, the following chapter, verse 7 of chapter 4, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. The surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. Yesterday, Friday night we went camping with the Scouts. We camped at Tom Bigby State Park. If you've never been there, I would encourage you to go. It's a beautiful, peaceful place. And then we were going to Tishomingo to canoe. Well, apparently we haven't had enough rain to canoe, so they said we couldn't canoe. But on the drive there, Grace called me and said, Dad, one of the leaders' husband tested positive for COVID this morning. And so we pulled over at the visitation place there on the trace. The leaders got out. We decided that I would drive the wife back to the campsite so she could, drive back to Starkville because she left her car here. And that way we'd get her away from everybody else. We wore masks all the way in and everything. She tested negative. All of her sons tested negative yesterday. But the reason I'm telling you this is because on the way back, she was saying that basically she was scared for our country. That she, in her mind, she's looking at all these things going on, and she's very concerned that this is the end of our country, the end of what we know as the United States. And I told her, I said, well, that very well may be true, but God is the one that makes that decision, not us. And so if we put our faith in God, that God's going to take care of us, then we won't be stressed and worried about that sort of thing. Sure, we should pray about it. Sure, we should do our part. But we should also constantly remind ourselves that nothing we can do as a human is going to change these things. What God decides to do is what's going to change that. And we should just have faith that God's going to take care of us and God's going to get us through this. I can tell you, 2020 and 2021 is not the first time people in the history of the United States have said the country's about to end. If you were alive during the 60s paying attention, this was a constant conversation about how this was the end of our country. And then the 70s, and then 9/11, and then. There's lots of times that we've said our country is going to fall apart. And it hasn't, because God hasn't let it. But when God decides He's going to let it, it's going to fall apart. We just need to keep our relationship with God and remember that everything that we do and everything that happens is because of our faith in God. I included two quotes there for B4 and B5. One, I don't know the source. It's all God's giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on God being with them. When they decided to do whatever it is they decided to do, they were confident that God was going to be with them. And so they stepped out of the box. They went into the lion's den. They led the people of Israel. They did all of these things. The only reason they did them was because they were confident God was going to be with them. The second quote there comes from a fellow by the name of William Carey. William Carey was a very prominent missionary. He built hospitals. He did all kinds of things. And in his mind, he did it because God gave him that power to do it. He said, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Nobody that ever jumped out of a plane didn't expect to land. Well, that's not true. Most people that jump out of a plane don't expect to land. Do expect to land. Do expect to land. They put a lot of confidence in that parachute. And so they go out of that plane thinking whoever rigged this parachute has got me. And it's going to open safely and I'm going to be fine. I promise you that if they didn't have confidence in that rigger of that parachute, they wouldn't jump out of the plane. To a much larger extent, when we do great things for God, we got to have confidence that God's going to take care of us, and then we got to step out and do it. God works through us to do great things. And so we have to expect great things from God and then attempt great things for God. And so that is the righteousness that we have to show as Christians today. In Hebrews 11:35b through 38, we've already read, you see a lot of examples of things that Christians or followers of God went through. Torture, mockings, floggings, chains, imprisonment, stoning, sawn in two, tempted, killed by the sword, went about in sheepskins and goatskins, were destitute, afflicted, and mistreated. And then in verse 39, and all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. In other words, they didn't have a good life here on earth, and they weren't around when Jesus came. They didn't get to see the new covenant, the new law that we are currently living under. They didn't receive what was promised. Verse 40, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. These people that he's talking about, the Hebrew writer, they were made perfect after their lives, not during their lives. Nothing that happened in verses 35b through 37 or 38 are things that we want to happen to us. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be mocked. I don't want to be flogged. I don't want to be put in prison. I don't want to be put in chains. I don't want to be stoned. I don't want to be sawn in two. I don't want to be killed with a sword. I don't want to wear goatskin, sheepskin, be poor, sick, or mistreated. But every single one of those has happened to followers of God. Verse 35, I don't want to be tortured. I don't want to be unreleased. I want to live a peaceful life. I want to live a profitable life. All of us do. But we are not guaranteed that. And God says here in Hebrews, this has happened to people. And if you look at every one of those situations, you can find a biblical reference to that particular thing happening to someone in the Bible, except for two. Except for sawn in two. We don't have any biblical account where an example is given of someone that was sawn in two. But the secular historians that were writing at the time of Isaiah, they say that's the way Isaiah died. That Manasseh sawed Isaiah into two pieces to kill him. And so that's the sort of torture that people have endured. And these people did not receive earthly rewards, but they will receive a heavenly reward. Turn to 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. But he said, this is where Paul is going through all the things that have happened in his life and all the difficulty he's had. And then in verse 9, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul says because he knows that he's doing God's will, and he's suffering because he's doing God's will, he's at peace with that. If you are suffering and you're not doing God's will, you better not be at peace with it. But if you are suffering and you know that you're doing God's will, then be at peace with it. God is going to take care of it. You may not have a successful earthly life as we define success, but you can have a successful eternal life, and that's what we should strive for. And then go back to Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 4. I always like pointing out conjunctions because there's only like 3 pieces of the English language that I can remember what they're for, and conjunctions is one of them. So the first word in Hebrews 12 is a conjunction. Therefore. In other words, all this stuff that happened in Hebrews 11, because of that, here's what we know in Hebrews 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, that cloud of witnesses is listed in Hebrews 11. All those people that are listed in Hebrews 11 are now watching us, watching the followers of God. Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such as hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. The Hebrew writer is saying, read this, know that these people are watching, and because they are watching, know that Jesus is also watching, and endure. Be strong. You can get through this. These people got through it. If you've ever had a boss and you had a job that required pain and fatigue and all kinds of things, it's a whole lot easier for you not to complain when that boss is right there with you working. When I was in the infantry, we would walk miles and miles and miles and miles with all kinds of heavy things on our back. And when I was in the mortars, there was a little Filipino guy, 37 years old. His name was Sergeant Tuli, I think it was. And wherever I walked, I was 21. I was in the best shape of my life. Wherever I walked, he was right there with me. And so I never complained when he was around, because he was 37 years old and carrying basically the same thing I was. He wasn't complaining. He was there with me. I was going to do it too. And so when we as Christians and followers of God are suffering, when we look around and we see these people and we see what they went through, that should give us pause about complaining. That should give us pause about wanting to quit, because these people didn't quit. They kept going for God, and we can too. And I believe that's the point of Hebrews 11. That look at all of these people and what they did for God. When you get discouraged, know that you ain't the first one. I doubt very seriously anybody hearing this sermon today is going to be sawn in two for Christ. I just don't believe it. We don't live in a country where that's going to happen. Now, we'll be tortured, we may be tortured, we'll be teased, we'll have all these other things. But when we think about being sawn in two for God, that's a tremendous sacrifice. And so we need to remember that these people are watching us. And they're not only watching us, they're rooting for us. They want us to win. They want us to join them in heaven, to be with God. And so what can we learn from Hebrews 11:32 through 40? The first thing we can learn is that faith is ready to sacrifice present comfort for future reward. Sin is easy. Sin is also pleasurable sometimes. Sin is just a lot easier road to travel on the earth than righteousness. But sin will lead you to an eternal destination in hell, and righteousness will lead you to an eternal destination in heaven. So we need to be ready to sacrifice present comfort for future reward. The second thing is, faith lives with a Godward focus, not a focus on people, things, or situations. We're in a situation now where if you spend a lot of time focusing, you're going to lose your faith on the situation. What you need to focus on is God. And God will get us through this situation. God will get us through to His eternal reward. And it may not be the way we want Him to lead us to that reward, but God will get us there. The third one is faith trusts and obeys God, leaving the results up to Him. You do the best you can do and leave the rest with God. Wednesday night in Bible study here, we were talking about having adult children that fell away from God. And Peggy used a phrase that I can't always remember, but it's such a powerful phrase. 4 words: let go, actually 5. Let go and let God. That's what we have to do. We have to let go and let God. Because God can handle it. We sometimes can't. And so we have to let God take control. And then finally, faithfulness to Christ counts more than anything else, including life itself. If you think back to the 12 apostles, Judas killed himself. As far as we know, John is the only one of the remaining 11 that died a natural death. The other 10 were killed for serving God. And so when we think about our own lives, if we are killed, it doesn't matter as long as our life is with Christ. And so when we think about our own lives and the things that are going on in our own lives, none of it matters as long as we are faithful to Christ. All of it matters if we're not faithful to Christ. And so we need to be sure and maintain that righteousness with God. This morning, as we are thinking about our own lives, if you haven't been baptized for remission of sin, then you're not a righteous person by God's estimation. And if you haven't been baptized, today's a great day to do that. Be baptized and become part of the kingdom of God. Most of us here today have been baptized for remission of sin. And when we have that righteousness that is given by God. But sometimes we slip up. Sometimes we lose faith. Sometimes we need the prayers of others. This morning, if you find yourself in need of those prayers, we'll be happy to pray for you. Whatever your need this morning, please come forward as we stand and sing.
Thank you for spending time with us today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns about what we've talked about, please call me or email me at the phone number and the email in the description below.